You are listening to the Horse Radio Network, part of the Equine Network family.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Disease du Jour. I'm your host, Carly Sisson, and in this episode I spoke with Dr. Johanna Kremberg about pre-purchase exams. The Disease du Jour podcast is brought to you by Merck Animal Health. Dr. Kremberg grew up in Brunswick, Maine, riding horses at every opportunity. She majored in English literature and Spanish at Middlebury College in Vermont. After her time in Vermont, she worked in botulinum research at Tufts University while she applied to veterinary school. In 2010, Kremberg graduated from The Ohio State University College of Veterinary Medicine and spent the following year in a rotating large animal internship at the University of Georgia. At Ohio State, she received the Excellence in Equine Surgery Award and was chosen as a 2009 AAEP Hiscox Insurance Scholarship recipient. Kremberg currently works at Grand Prix Equine in West Bedford, New York. She appreciates all aspects of maintaining the equine athlete and excels in endoscopy, ultrasound-guided injection techniques, and preventative medicine. Thank you, Dr. Kremberg, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So can you get us started by explaining what the main components of a pre-purchase exam are?
Very good. I would just preface that question with the fact that a pre-purchase exam really starts from the initial request, right? So when we have the request from either the client or the trainer for a pre-purchase exam, then the ball starts rolling for us in terms of getting the required pre-examination paperwork out to both the buyer and the seller. And then we, based off of that paperwork and their requests, then we go ahead and move forward with the exam. And of course, on the day of the examination, we want the horse to be ideally brought in out of its stall by us and our staff so we can see it in its natural setting beforehand. And then we will watch the horse on the cross ties and then do a brief examination, what I would call the static examination on the cross ties, as well as the exam before we move the horse into somewhere bright. We like to look at their eyes in somewhere dark. And then after the static examination would be the movement examination. And in our practice, we do that both in hand and also assess the horse under saddle. So I would say the pre-planning and then the two steps of the exam, both static and movement.
So who should be involved in the decision-making before and during the pre-purchase?
That's a good question. For us, there's usually quite a few parties involved. So you may have the buyer and then the buyer's agent or trainer, and then you may have the seller and then the seller's agent or trainer. So we like to have, in terms of the scheduling, all of those parties in the know. And then after we've scheduled the exam, then the decisions as to what diagnostics are performed apart from the exam itself, we use that pre-purchase exam paperwork for both the buyer and the buyer's agent to make those decisions, both based on our recommendations, based on cost, and based on the proposed use of the horse and our expectations of the horse going forward.
So I know one of the big challenges with pre-purchase exams are potential conflicts of interest that can arise while you're, performing the exam. So how do you handle these when you encounter them?
That's a great question and all too common. So the few clients that I work for that sell a high volume of horses, I have graciously stepped away from doing any of their purchase exams. The conflict of interest is too great. And the other situations come up when maybe a trainer has trained a horse up to a certain level and then would like to sell it to their current client that we work for both parties, right? So we always disclose that conflict of interest and have both of them aware of the conflict. But when it's going to be us taking care of the horse going forward, then we are certainly interested in having input on that purchase. So we, in those situations, as well, as long as the full medical record is open on the history of the case, and we feel comfortable with the history on the case, then we will move forward. But there are plenty of other times where a trainer or dealer is selling horses to clients of ours or horses being sold out of state to clients we don't work for regularly. And in those situations, especially if we have history on the horse, that would make it difficult for us to be objective in that purchase exam, then we graciously step away and make recommendations for other practitioners. So essentially, after these many years in practice, I've learned very much the hard way that being hypercritical of a horse and being, going through each case with a fine-tooth comb and discovering things even that the seller wasn't aware of, that we now have had enough situations where I would rather never have stepped into those murky waters and have chosen not to step into them to start. There is always going to be gray area because it's a small world. The horse world is very small. So we have plenty of times where, again, a horse is being sold from within the barn to some other client within the barn. And if we know the horse and the medical record is open, I feel comfortable continuing on with that purchase exam. And there are other times where we know there's a conflict and we can't be objective because we know the seller or the case too well.
Right, that makes sense. So what documentation do you provide to the buyer and when do you send this to them?
So Dr. Mark Baus is one of my mentors of many years and now business partner here at Grand Prix Equine. And he has imparted on me from early on that the record keeping is critical and that we should get the information to the buyer essentially before night's end. So we get our report. Most of my information is jotted down into the computer. Of course, the horse's registered name, their breeding, their height, color, their sex, their age, reported age, as well as, a passport age if we have one, or a Coggins date age, which of course these can all vary, as well as their microchip and marking. So all of that critical information I put into my record while I'm there at the farm. And we also measure the horse while we're there at the farm. And then, of course, there's going to be other findings that I might take a picture of, as well as make some brief notes. And then I'll clarify those notes later on my ride home, if it's a far away purchase exam, or later that night at home, and clarify those notes, making sure they're, as thorough as possible, but also as succinct as possible. And then I will forward on my report both to the buyer and the buyer's agent or their trainer, and sometimes even the buyer's veterinarian if they're out of state, get my report to them that evening, and then make further notes on the imaging as needed. So occasionally there is going to be imaging that I have questions on, especially now with taking more images of the cervical spine, of the lumbar spine. We have, sometimes more questions than answers, and I like to get a second set of eyes and a radiologist's opinion. So quite a bit of times on my, I would say in the more recent, maybe 3-year history now, I am sending off radiographs and ultrasounds of the case to a radiologist. And I highly recommend Inside Information. They're fantastic, but there's other great options. Dr. Sarah Puchalski, Dr. Natasha Werpy. There's great choices for sending off your images to a radiologist for a second opinion. And then I'll tell the clients that I'll get them that information usually within 24 to 48 hours. And whatever lab work we send off can take anywhere from 24 to 48 hours for a toxicology screen or drug screen. And then if there's other lab work, of course, CBCs and chemistries can come back quite quickly. But if we're doing EPM or Lyme titers, some clients want vitamin E levels, insulin levels, ACTH insulin would be common as well, depending on the age of the horse and the body condition. So we do have some lab work that might take a few more days, but obviously get that information to the client as soon as possible, because as you know, the money is burning a hole in their pocket. So we not just want to get our clinical picture down as soon as we finish seeing the horse, when the information is fresh in our minds, but also get the follow-up records to them as well. And we do almost all of our communication via email so that it's easily traceable.
Now, do you also release records to the seller, or is that the buyer's decision to release that information to them?
Oh, that's a very good question, and also sometimes murky waters. So the cases where the buyer, of course, most of the cases where the buyer decides to walk away, then the seller will ask why and want to have some information, or even have a consult with their veterinarian, or someone that knows the horse well may want to give some explanation for what they saw, or what we found. And that is the property of the buyer. Both our examination and any imaging is, of course, the property of the buyer, and that's up to their discretion. We have had times where the imaging has been sold to another purchaser later down the road instead of going ahead and repeating that imaging, and I let them determine that on their own.
Today's Disease du Jour podcast is brought to you by Merck Animal Health. The maker of prestige vaccines, Banamine, Flunixin Meglumine, Panacur, Fenbendazole, Regimate, Eltrenagest, Protozel, 1.56% diclazerol, antiprotozoal pellets, and other trusted equine health solutions, Merck Animal Health works for you and for horses. Learn more about Merck Animal Health's comprehensive portfolio of products, as well as our unconditional investment in our industry, profession, and community through programs such as the Respiratory Biosurveillance Program and unique solutions like biothermo temperature sensing microchips. Visit MerckAnimalHealthUSA.com for more information. Do you think it's worthwhile to take pictures or videos of the examination? I feel like this probably is most applicable if the buyer can't actually be there in person, but you'd love to hear more insight on that.
Yes, and I would say more often than not, we're looking at horses out of state or sometimes out of the country, or we're looking at horses where they have had an initial ride of the horse or trial period, but now we're looking at the horse back at home and assessing the horse without the buyer present. It's nice, but the buyers are busy people, and sometimes the trainers are very busy but available via text during the exam, and we keep them updated. But a lot of times we're looking at horses without anyone but the seller or the seller's trainer present, or sometimes even just a staff person who can ride a horse present at a horse show. We've done that too. So there's a lot of information that we are putting together, and some of that we know a picture can be worth 1,000 words. So there are times when I have something questionable, whether it's a small scar that I can't quite describe the location of the scar, and as well as I do take pictures now of the shoeing on the horse, because what might be a bar shoe to someone else might be, a rim pad to someone else, might be, described differently to someone else. So I always take a picture of the shoeing. I always take a picture of the ventral midline, as well as any other scars. I take pictures, of course, conformationally, just a kind of Coggins images, just as you might know, a basic image of the horse. And then we also use quite a bit of video. So now we've become quite systematic, and I like to refer back to these videos. I take horses ridden and in hand, trotting in both directions on hard and soft ground. I usually do arena footing, of course, when they're being ridden, and then hard footing when they're being jogged in hand. So going in both directions at the trot. I do also going in both directions at the canter while they're ridden. And then I take videos of the horse's neurologic exam as well. And all of this we save now on Dropbox. And then when we share our report, we share the images from Dropbox as well with the buyer and their agent. And that allows them to see what we're talking about in so many words, right? They might say they're not quite understanding something. And then when we show them the video of a slight nuance of the horse as it goes, from the canter lead one to the other, or a nuance of the horse as it's going up and down hills, as it's backing up, as we raise and elevate its head, there are times where these are a nuanced discussion, right? And we love having those video archives to be able to refer to. And now with the technology being quite easy, just using our cell phones, we can take the video and then upload it onto our Dropbox and allow us to, once we get decent Wi-Fi, can get all of that archived and up for us to share with them later.
So it sounds like it's probably helpful to bring a tech along with you to help you with videos so that you can really focus on the horse. Or, is it
Yes.
something that you're able to do fairly easily if you're by yourself, or do you try to always have a second person with you?
Oh, that's very critical too. I always have a set of hands with me. I take pretty bad radiographs and do a pretty bad job if I don't have my right hand woman with me, and I just don't want to do anything subpar. So what I highly recommend having a set of hands, both to do the exam the same every way, to get your videos and your pictures and your blood work and everything squared away. We have enough just with the communication and getting the horse looked at, examined, flexed, all of those things, that all of the ancillary additional items, I think it's critical to have a set of hands to help you with those. And like I said, to be systematic. A neurologic exam performed by one person versus another can have different outcomes. So I like it to be the same person every time. And then there's a lot to process to get blood work off to a couple different labs, to get the radiographs and ultrasounds uploaded and sent out. And it's just too much for me to do alone. So highly recommend having a set of hands to help you.
Yeah, that's great advice. So moving into the actual exam itself, do you find that inertial sensor readings and objective lameness assessment tools are worthwhile?
Yes, this is maybe a hot topic, maybe controversial, but in our practice, we now use the inertial sensors for all of our examinations. We use the equinosis system with an inertial sensor that goes on their head, right on their pole, and then one at the top of their pelvis. And then we have the oscillometer sensor that goes on their right front pastern. These all kind of Velcro and adhere on to their body, and for us work quite well. There is a new assessment system that I believe was developed in Europe that uses the camera on your phone and can read asymmetry as well using the camera on your phone. So I think there's lots of choices now. Luckily, there's options for all kind of price points, as well as for different personalities and preferences, I should say. And so because of that, now I do think it's really helpful to have an objective analysis of the horse. So not only do I have some video, but I also have my own subjective assessment, and then the objective assessment or analysis, which we call it an assessment of asymmetry of gait. So, this is not going to tell us there is no horse. When we're hooking them up, we always remind everyone there is no symmetric horse. There is no symmetric person. There is not going to be ever a perfect assessment. So we just are helping us quantify that horse's asymmetry that day and help us to determine if we see a little bit left front or we see a little bit right hind, how do we quantify that so that we could compare it to a reading at a later date, or compare it to what we see with our own eyes and help us to quantify that asymmetry. And I think that when I also receive purchase examinations from outside practitioners or clients that maybe bought a horse elsewhere and come, and I'll be reading through their pre-purchase exam, I cannot tell you how helpful that is, because their 1 out of 5 might be my 2 out of 5. And their 2 out of 5 might be my 1 out of 5. And we just have no way to really be objective without using a sensor system or a objective gait analysis system. And in my hands, it's really, really helpful.
Yeah, it seems like the more objectivity you can bring into these exams, the better typically. So that's good advice. What radiographs typically do you like to take during pre-purchase exams, and who should interpret them?
Very good. So I did touch on this a little bit before. We now do a radiograph package. So I would say a majority of the clients, once they pick and choose maybe, front feet with naviculars and hocks and stifles or whatever, once we sort of pick those few items that we want to make sure we cover, and then maybe we add on 1 or 2 other sites, we've already surpassed like what we call our package deal. And that includes the front feet, a single image of the carpus, all 4 fetlocks, both hocks, stifles, and then the neck. and the back. So we now have like kind of a conclusive package that includes the most critical areas, or the areas that we actually can image on the horse. And of course, in different populations, you're going to want, flexed radiographs of the knees and the fetlocks and maybe a yearling thoroughbred. So we realized that this is a bit more towards the middle-aged warm blood population, or even some thoroughbreds and mixed breeds and quarter horses that we do see. But I do think that it's nice to have kind of a package option so that people don't start to cut corners. I can't tell you the number of times that someone said, I did a full set of radiographs, and then we look back and they actually did, the hocks and the front feet. And their interpretation was that they did a set of radiographs. It wasn't a complete set. So we always end up, of course, the joint that we want, we didn't take. So I would much rather hedge clients towards taking a full set, so we don't have questions later, why did we not take that one stifle image? And then of course, when we're looking at images from abroad, a lot of times they'll take a single image of a stifle or a couple images of the neck and maybe not obliques if we want to look at something in particular. So I do usually tell clients, even if we have a recent set of images, maybe even in the last year, we don't have to repeat every single one, but repeat the ones that are not there. And then a large majority of radiographs I do send off now to Inside Information to have a radiologist's opinion. A couple of the things that I'm sticklers about with myself and others in our practice is making sure that there's markers on all radiographs, making sure that I have cropped the image correctly. And then I'm also now a stickler about removing shoes for navicular images. I can't tell you the number of times I've received navicular radiographs with the shoes still on. There are extenuating circumstances where we just can't, because the horse is showing in an hour or whatnot, that we can't get the shoes off to take those pictures. But I just always recommend it. And I've had a couple sellers that really push back about it. And I just have to disclose that the seller refused us removing the shoes, and we can only image so much with the shoes on. But there's just information that no matter how many obliques and images, we just can't see the full structures of the foot with the shoe on. So yes, we take quite a few for a complete set, and then usually have, I would say I ultrasound, not every case, but based on palpation, based on lameness, based on any findings on the radiographs. And then, of course, the value of the horse. There are situations where we do ultrasounds without question, just to rule out anything else, that's smoldering. I do find that ultrasounds are a little harder to interpret without any clinical significance. You're going to find something on ultrasound. And a lot of times that's just notable, but not significant. But I have a harder time, of course, parsing through that. And maybe that's just my naivete, but I do find that you're going to find more on ultrasound that I can't always give a explanation for.
Yeah, so on the topic of ultrasounds, are there any areas you tend to ultrasound most frequently during PPEs, or are there any radiographic findings that you encounter commonly that might prompt you to take ultrasounds?
That's a very good question. I would say now we have a bit more information about how the suspensory origin should image on both the carpus and the tarsus. So those DP images, we now have a bit more information as to how the suspensory origin should look, and if there's something really irregular there, as well as any palpation or lameness findings on our exam, then we may use that information to, go forward with an ultrasound and more carefully inspect that. I also now on necks, if there's, a significant finding on a cervical vertebral facet joint on a radiograph, then I may also pull out my ultrasound and take a look at the surfaces of the bone, with where I can, a cervical radiograph always has two facets overlapping. So even on an oblique, you have quite a lot of overlapping structures, where on an ultrasound, we can look at just one facet at a time. And there are times where I'll look for pathology, fluid, or any other findings that may be only on ultrasound. But I would say the suspensories, of course, definitely suspensory branches are more easily palpated and would be something that I would jump to ultrasound as well. Of course, any old bowed tendons, superficials, check ligaments. There's going to be cases where even they say to us, this horse has a history of, something in this limb, just to disclose it because we're going to feel it right off the bat. And then they'll tell us maybe some history on that case, or we might palpate something right off the bat and know that we're going to take a scan and see where it's at this time.
So I guess moving a little bit away from the exam itself and more into some of the legal issues around PPEs, what are some of the most common disputes that veterinarians might be sued for, and how do you lessen your risk?
Yes, disclose. I think that absolutely the conflict of interest discussion we just had without complete disclosure before imparting on the purchase exam is one of the top issues. And then after that is, we know now through PLIT that one of the reasons that our PLIT dues and premiums are so high for equine veterinarians is because of the fact that we are facilitating transactions of sometimes very large amounts of money for these horses. And we sometimes are the make or break right before they make that decision. And we want it to be very clear to them what they're buying. And again, there is no perfect specimen, but we need to make sure that we are disclosing all that we find. And we are going through the radiographs with a fine-tooth comb, and then having a radiologist's second opinion with someone that only looks at, equine sports, performance horse, equine radiographs day in, day out. I think that is become critical for me because I have many situations I've heard that where some small finding in a busy practitioner, if I'm looking at radiographs in a sunny barn or even in my sunny car on the way home, there's just things that you don't always see. And so having that second set of eyes and having a radiologist write their own separate report from our findings is one great way to protect ourselves. And of course, having the information, we also disclose, what the horse's history was. That was on our reports. We write what medical history was disclosed to us, vaccine dates, as well as any, the passport that was disclosed or anything else medical history wise that was disclosed, and then state that any other unknown history is not, unfortunately, we don't have a crystal ball. We also put a comment at the end of our purchase exam that whether or not the seller or the seller's agent is a client or previous client of Grand Prix Equine. So we make a statement there. And if there is a conflict, then we again have not just talked about it with them before, but we make a statement again on the exam form that there was the seller or the seller's agent has been a client of Grand Prix Equine and the records are open and this and this and this. Or we state, of course, that most of the time the seller is not a client of Grand Prix Equine and the horse has not been attended to by me or any veterinarian in the practice. And we also have a bit more information as to how this examination should be used, and that this examination is concerning the purchase of the horse. And in the end, ultimately, the responsibility of the purchaser, the responsibility is on them as whether or not they go through with this purchase. But we are obviously giving them the information on that day. So I do have some canned language. If anyone ever wanted that, I'm happy to share it. I also have some canned language about, lumps and bumps and melanomas and things that we find on a horse that just helps me to say to them, we can only tell you where we're at today, but this melanoma may be very different in 5 or 10 years. And it's always worth having all of that documented. So I think as long as everything is documented very clearly and completely on your report, you're protecting yourself quite a lot. And after that, the choice is theirs.
So do you have anything else you'd like to add on the topic of PPEs before we wrap up?
No, I think it's, like I said, I try to not enter muddy waters. I think that's one of my take-home messages. And then also know that your interpretation and your communication will improve with time.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kremberg, for joining us. And thank you to our audience for listening. And a very special thank you to our sponsor, Merck Animal Health. If you have any questions or suggestions for the podcast, please send me an email at csisson@equinenetwork.com. That's CSISSON@equinenetwork.com.